Alena Bachleitner works at the office of the Austrian Fiscal Advisory Council as an economist, and she is doing her PhD at the University of Vienna. I think a supervisor is Christina Zulehner, right? Who is also affiliated with WIFO. So Alena is primarily interested in fiscal policy, European economic governance, and microsimulation models, I think. And her colleague, Doris Prammer, works in the Economic Research Department of the Austrian National Bank. And in her research, she focused on questions regarding fiscal and tax policy. So Doris has published in different academic journals such as Fiscal Studies, the Monetary Policy, and the Economy, and the International Journal of Central Banking. So today, the two of them are going to present their work on the assessment of the debt forecast error. So today we're going to learn whether forecasts of the debt ratio are biased and in which direction a possible bias tends, and whether or not the European Commission is immune to such a bias in its forecast. So their presentation will take about 30 minutes, and after that, our colleague Simon Loretz has provided a short comment, which will take about 10 minutes. So that leaves us with about 20 minutes time for discussion. Any questions for understanding? Please just raise your hand. Also in the virtual room, just raise your hand. Both of them are happy to answer them. But any discussion inputs, please wait for our general discussion at the end of the seminar. So with that, don't forget to mute your micros, and except of the two of you, of course. And yeah, well, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us. I will start the presentation, and Alena will take over the beginning of the presentation. As it's joint work, we decided to present it jointly. Okay. Well, I will start off with why are we interested in government debt error. So primarily because with the fiscal governance review, institutions and researchers alike have suggested to put a greater focus on public debt developments instead of deficit developments, which have been the main anchor for assessing fiscal policy sustainability so far.
I think you can also downsize if you want
minimize
to.
it, yeah.
Yeah, minimize.
Okay. Why is that important to have fiscal rules and have the sustainability of public finances as well in mind when you assess governments and their well-being? Well, with the setup of the EMU, I mean, fiscal policy could create spillovers. That's why it was decided to have like fiscal rules. And that's why member states have been asked to provide their fiscal plans each year in the stability and convergence programs. These fiscal plans comprise information on deficits and debt past. However, as I already said, the focus of the fiscal framework was basically on the deficit, and only recently, with the surge in the debt ratios, institutions and policymakers understood or started to understand that it should not be the deficit, but the debt developments that are important and should be the main fiscal anchor. And that's why in the revised fiscal governance framework, which has only recently been out as a legislative proposal, there is an important rule for the debt forecasts. Namely, they should be taken as the baseline from which operative fiscal rules then are derived. This importance of deficits, of debts, it's also important to know how well these debt forecasts are and if they can be used actually as an or providing an anchor, or if they can be used to assess ex ante fiscal developments and derive operative rules from them. That's why we are basically interested in seeing if the fiscal forecast is good from the governments or not. If there are differences in that forecast errors for different horizons, different countries, or over time, and of course, if we would find that there are that forecast errors, we are interested in what drives this forecast error. So is it really government optimistic thinking that makes that forecast error, or is it coming from somewhere else? And then it's already mentioned, a European Commission's forecast error says as well. Why do we do so? Because they are planned to act as a benchmark. That's why we also have to look at them. And what's not in the paper, but we will present here, are the results from Austria on the debt forecast. We will sum up with some takeaways. Well, as already mentioned, there is some kind. There was always this focus on the deficit developments. That's why there's also a rich literature on deficit forecast errors. What are the main findings? Well, that the overly optimistic budget balance forecasts are the rule rather than the exception. Then these over-optimistic budget balance forecasts are mainly due to over-optimistic growth forecasts, or that expenditure targets are overshot and not met by additional tax measures or revenue side measures. And what this literature finds as well is that in the short term, both governments and international institutions have the same degree of accuracy for the deficit forecast. The literature on that forecast is much sparser. It mostly focuses on individual countries and has a strong focus on the US. Only recently, the IMF did a debt forecast analysis based on their own forecasts. So IMF was assessing their own forecasts for debt development for the set of countries they forecast debt development. The main finding in this literature is there exists a positive forecast error and is more pronounced in the long term and during recessions. That error is mostly due to overly optimistic budget forecasts and its growth that has contributed heavily to this debt forecast error. However, as there is no information on how well EU countries altogether do with their debt forecasts, we are trying to fill the gap with our research. And that's why we try to figure out what the governments themselves forecast. And that's why we get the data on government forecasts from the stability and convergence programs. We have information on all EU member states. However, we had to exclude Greece and Ireland due to data issue, or for Greece as well, also because it was a program country for some time and didn't submit convergence the stability program. The time period we cover is from 2000 to 2021. And in these programs, we have the government's forecasts for deficit, debt, stock flow adjustments, and GDP. Stock flow adjustment, I just shortly explain, is the difference which makes the debt rate has an impact on the debt ratio, which is not GDP growth and which is not included in the deficit. And our horizon we cover is T-1, which means we have a realization in T-1 and then a forecast for the next 3 years. For comparing to the AMECO database, we use the European Commission Springs projections from the AMECO database, covering the same years, the same variables. However, the forecast horizon only reaches up to T+1, which limits somehow the comparability to T and T+1 forecasts. So let's now look at how the information stability and convergence programs look like. You see on these two plots a solid black line, which is the realized debt to GDP ratio for on the left-hand side Austria, on the right-hand side Italy, and in green we have the forecasted debt development for each year and over the horizon. So if eyeball inspection would tell us about Austria, well, it's sometimes overestimated and sometimes underestimated. For Italy, on the right-hand side, it seems that they are generally very optimistic, expecting an ever decreasing debt path, while in fact it actually increases. We calculate the forecast error from this information by subtracting the forecast from the realized value, which means we measure the vertical line from the black to the green. This is, again, what I just explained, how we define the forecast error, which means that when we take the realized minus the forecasted error, value means that a positive value implies that the realized debt ratio was higher than the forecasted debt ratio, and that the forecast was overly optimistic. And for the realized value, we take first release data and not whatever might be revised afterwards and what is in the databases now. Why do we use the first release data? Because that's what the European Commission uses to assess government developments. So, well, that's our forecast errors for different forecast horizons. We see that we have pictured the forecast horizon T on the very left-hand side and T+3 on the very right-hand side. We see that the debt to GDP forecasts are increasingly optimistic, that the debt forecast error reaches some 4 percentage points at the end of the projection horizon, which is in our case T+3. And that also this forecast error is statistically significant from 0. So there is indeed a positive forecast error, meaning that on average EU member states expect an improvement of the debt ratio, but in actually experience worsening.
So the dots are individual countries, is this correct?
The red dot is the average, EU average, which is averaged over individual countries. But of course, the plot shows all data we have, so you also have the distribution of the data in this kind.
Yeah, but each black dot is a country.
Each black dot on the
country in a certain point of time.
Yes,
it's one observation. It's an
one
outlier.
observation.
But the points are the outliers.
Yeah, it's just a people. Well, I would outliers. I mean, there have been quite a few with like
differences
of 50 percentage points. Yeah, it's like a box plot, but we wanted to show the distribution. That's why we took the violin plots. Anything to add on the presentation? Okay, well, as we are seeing that obviously it gets harder to forecast over the longer the horizon is taking. And of course, we see also that it's not taken as a target, because if it was a target, you could adjust your fiscal policy in the meantime to reach it. But I mean, the forecast error gets larger and larger over the horizon. What are we seeing here? Well, that's for each year, the debt forecast errors for over all horizons. So here we just look, for example, 2000. What was the forecast for 2000 from T-1, from then it was T+1, T+2, T+3.
Accumulated.
Pardon?
Accumulated.
Accumulated for this all countries, all horizon, but for this.
So accumulated is the average error over all forecast horizons.
Just unweighted.
So the question we wanted to answer with that or look at was, are there specific years that are harder to predict than other years?
Okay.
And of course, as we see, I mean, crisis years are harder to predict, which is 2020 and all these years after the great economic and financial crisis, which is 2009 to 2011, 12, or even further on.
Does the debt ratio also include the bank rescue packages?
The debt ratio is in fact showing all these things, and they usually show up in the stock flow adjustments.
Also,
So, yeah.
the sale of properties, for instance, is low as the debt, but not the GDP. If the government sells some premises, some houses, for instance,
Yes.
it's not part of the budget,
Yes.
part of the
Yeah.
deficit, but it's part of the debt.
Yes, yeah. All this is included, and it's usually stock flow adjustment. What we can also see from looking at this graph is that when there is a positive output gap, then the debt to GDP ratio is usually overestimated, which means that it turns out better than it actually is, and of course vice versa.
I don't think it's a business cycle, it's a higher
You
trade
could
course.
tell there is some kind of business cycle in even the debt forecast errors. Yeah. Well, as we just know that there are high forecast errors, we were still wondering if at least the direction of the debt development were correctly projected, so that if you expect or project a decreasing debt path, that there actually is a decreasing debt path. You just underestimate the size or overestimate the size. That's what we are looking in this table. We take the year t-1 and look at what and compare it to the debt ratios in t+1, and so on, to see what was actually planned, the planned change, which is in the first row, and the second row is what was actually the realized change. And we didn't have any prior on what the development is would be like in this case. What we see is that in the first year, the planned change is usually a worsening of the debt ratio. When we see t-1 minus the debt ratio planned for t is a minus, which means that the debt in t is actually higher than it was in t-1. So for the first 2 years, what was planned was actually a worsening or a stabilizing of the debt ratio. And only at the end of the projection horizon, t+2 and t+3, there was a planned improvement of the debt ratio. So the consolidation, which might have been necessary, was shifted to the end of the forecast horizon. What did we observe? Well, countries were quite good in looking at the realized change in the debt to GDP ratio. Countries were quite good in estimating the forecasts or the direction of forecast in T. However, starting from t+1, they expected an ever decreasing debt ratio when actually it was increasing. The minus signals that they expected lower in t+3. Sorry, I'm in the realized, so it was actually higher than it was expected on average. Yeah. We also had a look at for specific countries, which we call high debt member states. For us, they are Belgium, Italy, France, and Portugal. I have to say why, because those countries were very close to 60% to GDP ratio all over our observation period, and for a very long time, even over 90%. So that's how we defined the high debt countries. What can we observe here? That the realized change in the debt ratio, meaning the debt increase, was even much stronger than for the overall average. And in addition, they even planned a much stronger consolidation. So the 3.48 in the first line would have been the improvement in the debt ratio, which they planned. Actually, they experienced worsening of the debt ratio of about 6 percentage points. So far to how the debt forecast error of large it was. Now we see the reasons why there was a debt forecast error.
Okay, so from here onwards, I take over. as I said, to hopefully answer the question, what actually drives the forecast error, and are the drivers in the responsibility or part of the responsibility of the government? In order to answer this question, we started out to decompose the debt forecast errors into its subcomponents, starting with the general accounting identity and augmented by the stock flow adjustments. So, as we shortly discussed before, also the stock flow adjustments are quite relevant to explaining the changes in the debt quotas. And that's also why we found it to be very important to include this as a specific driver of the debt forecast error. This is also quite in contrast to the literature on this topic so far. So you can see the decomposition here in the formula, which decompose it into first the deficit error, the stock flow adjustment error, the debt T-1 error. So this is typically due to some statistical revisions, and the GDP denominator error. So here the forecast errors in the nominal GDP comes into the forecast error of the debt to GDP ratio.
The other component, sorry. So the GDP denominator error and the deficit error is kind of independent. What is SFA error?
Stock flow adjustment error.
Okay. Would this not be included in debt -1?
We explicitly excluded it, so we calculated out of the debt T-1 error to be able to distinguish between those two. So this is also a very specific thing in our paper, because the literature typically puts it into the debt T-1 error and then cannot distinguish it. So here in the table, we can see the results of it, and we can already see in the aggregated forecast error, the more put into numbers, the observation that we had before, that it becomes more optimistic over the time, and that from T+1 onwards, the forecast error are significantly different from 0. But now we can also see what it actually drives. And we have as one input the debt T-1 error, but it is, the size of it is, especially in the medium term, small but significant. But by size, the most significant two drivers of the forecast errors are the deficit error and the stock flow adjustment error. The GDP denominator effect, on the other hand, is not significant from T+1 onwards. But now to more details on this, because maybe it comes by surprise that the GDP forecast error is not significantly relevant. Here, it's really just the GDP denominator effect. And we were asking ourselves then, okay, but also the deficit error kind of is driven by GDP forecasts. And part of the deficit error is probably due, or might be due to, wrong GDP forecasts. And to answer this, we use the approach to adjust the deficit by the real GDP forecast error. And to be able to do this, we use the European Commission's budget balance semi-elasticities. So how much changes the balance when the real GDP changes by 1%. So we calculated the real GDP forecast error and then adjusted the deficit error by the semi-elasticities of the forecast error of the real GDP. And when we do this, the picture actually changes a bit. So we now have the adjusted deficit error, which is really just, or we see it more as the structural component of the deficit. So really the wrongly forecasted measures, for example, by the government. And then we included the real GDP forecast error on the deficit to the GDP denominator effect. So this together is here now the forecast error of the wrong GDP forecast.
Sorry, this is real GDP, you said?
It's the percentage. It's the percentage change forecast error in the GDP in the debt to GDP forecast error, driven once by the real GDP forecast error, which gets into the deficit, and we calculated it out, and the GDP denominator effect exposed, which is
But it's
So
not,
the real error, but not GDP.
Yeah, it's both. It's the
okay.
because both is measured in
You can
the
break that, the denominator is nominal.
no, it's both measured in percent of GDP error.
Okay.
So it's the same measurement. It's just driven by different errors. So then, sorry. If we now adjust this, we find that, of course, the flow adjustment is still the significant driver, but also now this GDP error becomes more relevant. We then also looked into the European Commission forecast as a benchmark. One, because also in the past, the European Commission forecast was the benchmark to assess the fiscal rule. And secondly, in the future, the role of the European Commission forecast becomes even more relevant due to the European government review. And then also, as a third argument why we looked at it, is we wanted to compare the government forecast to an independent institution forecast, also to get a feeling, well, is an independent institution here better than the government? If they are very biased, the government, then the independent institution should actually work better. Here, only in the normal decomposition, we also found that the European Commission's forecast is significantly underestimates debt development for T+1. We only have up to T+1 because the European forecast is not for in the future. And we also see that the size of the forecast error is very similar to the size of the forecast error of the governments. And also here, the stock flow adjustment is the largest source of error and therefore very important to understand why there actually is a focus error. And all here, the interesting difference between the European economic forecast is that for high debt countries, the forecast errors are actually larger than the errors of the governments itself. For other countries, the European Commission forecast is typically more accurately than the one of the government. Lastly, only for this presentation, and yeah, because we thought maybe here it might be interesting, how does it look in Austria? Of course, but the results are not significant. That's also the number of observation decreases as we only look at one country. But we also can see that on average, at least the average also increases over the time horizon and also more in the over-optimistic direction. When we decompose it into the subcomponents by the accounting identity, then we see that in Austria, especially the stock flow adjustments explain the focus error more than the other parts. The main takeaways out there quite shortly is that the debt ratio forecast in the past have been too optimistic, and they become always more too optimistic the longer the forecast becomes. And the main drivers are the stock flow adjustments and the GDP forecast errors. And in the high debt countries, this forecast errors is even more pronounced than in other countries. And they are even more too optimistic than the rest of the countries.
Excuse me, could you just explain again, please, shortly, what are stock flow adjustments?
The stock flow adjustments?
Well,
Maybe you can.
Yeah, okay. Stock flow adjustment would be like the government was taking on bank debt in the case of the nationalization of the banks, and a huge part of this debt was only recorded in the debt, but not in the deficit. Why was that? Because there was no actual payment, for example. However, on the other hand, the stock flow adjustment might be like when the taxes in the corona pandemic, there were suspended. So there was no income. So the state didn't receive any money, but from an accounting point of view, they were recorded as a revenue in the deficit. But of course, there was no revenue. So to make up for that, you had to take up higher debt.
But that you had to adjust the debt.
And that's and this difference between the two developments is the stock flow adjustment.
One good example, if they sell premises or houses, the government, it's not part of deficit. You cannot lower deficit by selling an office building, yes? But it lowers the debt, yes? So they say this is not part of debt. You are not allowed to record it, but in debt. And also on the other side, there are some payments.
Yeah, because they say that's like an exchange of assets. And it's like
I'm wondering that this accounts obviously for a lot, that for something. This is I saw this is sometimes governments want to manipulate, bring down this and this, but it describes a lot of these forecast errors. I mean, this is
should be driven by a certain years. So
maybe.
So
It is, but perhaps can we
Let us
finish? You can.
going into the discussion.
I think you're fine. No?
Yeah, you're fine. We're perfectly on time. Thanks for that. Yeah. Do you want to jump into your presentation?
Okay, let me start with, I think that was a pleasure to read because that was for once a really clear and easy to understand research question where everybody has an idea of what you're talking about and it's highly relevant. And it's given that like we are an applied research institute, this is kind of research which is really spot on for us. It's really interesting for us to read and really important that you do this stuff. So it was a pleasure to read and it was a very intuitive result in the end. So the two main results are, some could call it trivial, but it's you always have to say it and show that the trivial things also hold. So crises are hard to predict. This is not surprising. So the financial crisis and even more so COVID, well, the debt took a complete, went south basically. So it went all wrong and nobody could predict that. So that's not very surprising. But it's good that the data shows it. It's reassuring the data shows that's plausible because nobody can expect the pandemic and nobody expected the complete economic outfall. So that's the first thing, which is pretty trivial, but it's good to see. The second thing is that nowcasting is actually quite good. So it's like for the given year, the governments are not reporting something completely crazy, but they're reporting pretty much unbiased and spot on. And at the long term, that forecast gets worse. This is also like being part of the forecast team. This is not surprising. Forecasts are difficult because they concern the future. So that the further you go into the future, the more it's uncertainty. So that you get more variation, that's expected. And if you think a bit more than 2 seconds, that you get like a bias here is also not very surprising. It's very intuitive that you get like this positive bias. And so that's the two main results are here. Well, debt forecasts are getting worse over time, and there's a bias there. There's a positive bias. And some more specific, and this is basically, again, from your paper, saying like, okay, if you're a high debt country, you're even worse. So the high debt countries are even worse in predicting their debt. The others are moderately biased, but the high debt countries are really clearly positively biased. So that's a specific feature, okay. Well, in a sense, it's not surprising either, because like if you constantly wrongly estimate your deficit and are always higher with your debt, you end up being a high debt country. So in a sense, this raises the important question, are these countries systematically different? So they picked 4 countries by a really clearly defined threshold, so it's 4 countries, and they are different. They are high debt countries, and they basically are performing worse in the debt forecast. So this is a specific property, and I think this is also very intuitive. In a sense, the next step would be to understand why are they different. Were they always different and let's just continue as they are, or did they become different once they became a high debt country? And now for basically two comments. I was trying to understand what's driving the result. And my initial thought, like, well, if I do a budget forecast and the longer time horizon, it always went completely unrealistic because you do a budget forecast under a no policy assumption. And if you have like a progressive tax which accumulates over time, you always have like loads and loads of revenues coming in, and you know it will not materialize because at some point in the forecast horizon, there will be a tax reform. So there's a typical assumption in the forecast is a no policy change assumption. If you don't factor in all your planned policy changes, it's very likely that you have like a partial explanation of that optimistic debt forecast. But then at the same time, you could say, well, no, these are governments, they should put in the planned policy changes. In a sense, if this is a proper steering tool and it's a proper strategic program, all the policy reforms should be in there. So probably you're not able to get away with like, okay, well, we know we will have a tax reform, we're not putting it in here. And then I say, well, yes, no, yes, again, yes, because potentially, because what's really happening here, and that's leading to the next point on the next slide, is the fiscal forecast done by the government is based on the GDP forecast by independent research institutes. And they use a no policy assumption. So if you basically have a tax reform even factored in there, it might not show up in the GDP. So there might be something misaligned. So if I put it on the next slide, so there's an heterogeneity of GDP growth. And at some point in the paper, I found the statement that the high debt countries also have a larger GDP denominator error. And this, I could say, could be due to the heterogeneity of GDP. Because basically, if you are a high debt country and need some fiscal consolidation, you put in some reforms as key as like have like a whatever tax increase or spending cut or so. So if you have a restrictive fiscal policy, that should have a negative feedback on GDP growth. But you base that on the GDP forecast, which does not factor in such tax or fiscal reform. So that might contribute to this systematic error. So this is kind of a problem you have in the system because you're requiring the governments to do their forecast on an external GDP forecast, and it's not fully consistent. So this is one potential explanation where you can have like this bias for the high debt countries. And to finish off, I have some questions which might be a bit too much for this current paper, but it's always good to have like future research ideas. So the first question which came to my mind is like, okay, so like for the high debt countries in particular, the primary balance forecasts are overly optimistic. So this could be if you go one step further, is it either too much revenue or too little revenue or too much expenditure? And if you are basically, they could overestimate the capacity to tax, which I think is not often the case, but it's more often that they are not strict in the expenditure control. So like the expenditures are running high. So it would be interesting to see that, but you could actually break down where do they go wrong. The second point, and this is also probably a bit too much for this paper, but it's also a natural follow-up question is, well, we have like anchor points in the EU legal framework. So you have 60% of debt, which you should not go surpass. And as soon as you're above that, you kind of get an idea by the stability and growth pact what you should do, and that's probably what you write in your forecast. Even if you never plan to do that, but you probably write that into your forecast. That's something you might be actually trying to see whether countries which are passing these focal thresholds, whether they start changing in the debt forecast error. That would be interesting to see, basically. So as soon as you're in the corrective arm, are you getting the forecast getting worse because you just don't do forecasts, but you write what the Commission wants to see? That would be something that would be very interesting to look at. And the final point, and that's something which is in the paper, and it was not fully clear to me whether you have an explanation for that. And you have a significantly positive error for the starting value for all countries. So that's I think quite intriguing that it's not big. It's 0.2% of GDP, which is, but it's very precise, and it's I think very interesting that you have kind of apparently a bias in the National Statistics Office or anything, which is I found very interesting. And the second thing related to that is that by chance that it's comparable with the forecast error and stock flow adjustments. Could it be that the stock flow adjustments are to some extent just a pure noise process which nobody understands? And even the statistics office are not understanding it, because we as a forecaster always struggle to understand what's in there. Like currently we start to see, okay, there must be something building up in the stock flow adjustments, for example, because of the disaster or the arches in the debt management. So sometimes you have an idea, or you know, okay, there was this big banking crisis, so you have a massive assets there. But most of the time, it's just pure noise, and you don't know. But that's why I found it quite interesting that actually there's a bias in there, because for me, it was mostly noise. And I basically stop here and probably leave it for open discussion.
Thank you very much, Simon. Do you want to reply directly to some of the points, or should I open the general discussion first?
Well, I mean, there were so many points raised. Thank you very much. Very helpful for us. Let me just reply to some of them. I mean, of course, the deficit focus the debt is increasing, but that also means, I mean, of course, there are numerous things that can cause it, but the thing is also the debt ratio at T+3 is not seen as a target, because if it was, then you should, whatever might come in between, you should have the aim to keep this target, and that's what it's supposed to be now, a target value. And that cannot, I mean, in the past, it did not prove useful because it was never a target. It was like whatever we say, and there is something in between. So you're right in saying, well, there are so many reasons and in the endogeneity causes causing this. But if it were a target, you should do something to achieve it, which is never done.
I think especially in the context of the where it's more fixed, then the question is, well, when we aren't really able to fix something in 4 years, like fix the target in 4 years, so we obviously deviate from it. Is it a good idea to fix it in 10 years or in 7 years, depending on which path you are? But so I think this was also like a starting point for us for this analysis. Like, is it realistic what at the moment the European Commission actually proposed?
Then coming to your idea of disentangling the reason for the primary deficit error, I mean, of course it's interesting, but I think this is covered by the whole literature on deficit-focused errors, where they actually find that usually they miss the expenditure targets, and that it's growth that's causing the deficit-focused errors. So I think, even though it's important, but I think this part of the analysis has been captured by the deficit-focused error literature, and there is plenty of it. What no one has done so far yet is really having a close look at the debt ratio developments. And if that's done, then of course stock flow adjustments are neglected because, as you just said, statistically it should be like noise and it should balance over the longer term. However, there has been a recent paper by Alfonso at co-authors looking only at realized drivers of that, and he's finding that over the past years, it was stock flow adjustment that was one of the main reasons for that error. Yeah.
I fully appreciate that the stock flow adjustment is an important addition. So the tax revenues and expenditures would be in addition to the stock flow adjustment. I'm not suggesting that you go on tax revenues and deficit only, but you would basically have then three things rather than that. So it would be even a bit more complicated.
I mean, I see, but I wanted to make the point that this is covered with all the literature on deficit forecast errors. I mean, we could have it as an add-on, but it was, I mean, no news to that. I mean, we probably would also find that in the EU average, it's missed expenditure target. That's the reason, and it's growth. That's the reason. I mean, for the growth, we have already shown it, and as you are asking for differences between high debt and other countries, I mean, what we also see for the government forecast is that the structural deficit forecast error is also higher for high debt countries than for other countries, which we decided to interpret as they even misestimate the measures. I mean, because the structural should be based on what changes in fiscal policy are used to measures like tax reforms or whatever. And for high debt countries, we found that this is significant part of the error. That might be a political decision to present oneself better than one is, but that's a difference to the remaining countries, as we call them, because I think you wanted to have.
So basically, these are different. The question was more like, are these countries different inherently, or have they become different because they're in the corrective arm? Because they have like an expected forecast. The Commission expects them to meet the criteria, and that's why the forecasts are, well, they are biased towards to meet the criteria.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting aspect with
and basically the criteria are there, but
not with the exercise. If the European Commission forecast that they will meet their targets, should be also.
Yeah, I mean, there should be a large difference then between the European Commission forecast and the government's forecast. So if there is this bias due to the rule, then the European Commission's forecast should hopefully not try to hit the target. But I think it's an interesting aspect. We once started to look at the change by the 2011 change in the fiscal rules. Maybe that rule was more operational within the fiscal rules. But this was a difficult comparison because also then some of the countries still had bank nationalizations and COVID, so also the years were very different before and after 2011. So, but this might be an interesting way to analyze this. Changes by the 60%.
But for the 2011 after and before, when the debt rule was strengthened, we didn't find any significant difference between before and after. So it was not getting better. I mean, that might be because the years were more difficult to forecast, because crisis years were all after. That's why we decided not to put it in a paper, because.
But that's why I think this approach might be very interesting to like always group the countries by whether they reached the 60% or not, or how far away they are, and if they then change the forecast more.
So we still have some minutes left. Yes, 2 questions.
And there are 2 questions and 1 remark. I mean, one is, I was surprised to learn from Simon that we have independent GDP forecast. I think there are only 3 countries in Europe which have really 3 independent forecasts. all other countries, the ministry does it and send it to the Fiscal Council for endorsement. How good this works or not, I have no idea. I remember one of the first studies of Mariela was to look at the 3 countries, whether they have a bias, and all others they have. They say all others you cannot tell, but the 3 definitely don't have. Yes. So this is connected to my second question. Did you check for any break point due to the introduction of the fiscal councils? Because you have a time span from 2000 to 2020. I guess not, because normally if you have a break in the levels, you incur some autocorrelation of positive autocorrelation of order 1 problem. And I'm sure you've checked in your recitals and there is none. So maybe there is not really a significant improvement through due to the introduction of fiscal councils. But did you check for this, or any idea whether the fiscal council changed anything in this picture, or nothing? It was just a waste of money.
You're working there, so it's okay. Now you don't answer the question, right?
The job is on the line.
I can answer it. I mean, we had a look at 2011 when the debt rule was strengthened. And I think also in 2011, or was it 13, the fiscal councils had to be set up. Mm-hmm. I think it was 2011. So we had it was at the same time. And we had a look at 2000 before and after 2011. However, there was no significant difference between these 2 groups of years. However, 2011 had, if you remember the focus areas, there was a lot of debt nationalization from banks, and to 2020. I mean, we were running robustness checks without 2020, but we didn't exclude it from the second set. So we did not see any difference. And I think it's 6 countries having independent forecasts. And the thing is, 6. I mean, we were told by the European Fiscal Board Secretary. The question you are asking is also, I mean, we were also comparing to the EU, the forecast errors, and they had the same forecast errors. And we assume that the European Commission, is an independent institution and should not be biased.
This is exactly my last question. Why is there a bias in the GDP forecast of the or the debt forecast of the European? They should not. Maybe to the other side, I could understand. I mean, for the countries, I understand they're optimistic. They do not want to have so stark changes in their policies. And the European Commission, as the guard, should go to the other side. Would be maybe. I think Simon already mentioned 1 or 2 things. One is the no policy change.
But the European Commission has only T+1, so I think the no policy change assumption here really.
Okay, and the positive error of the starting value. It could be another, because I have no idea where this could come from. You neither, not?
Well, I mean, you know how this procedure of the forecasting for regional commission works.
Okay, the explanation. Yes, I know.
Yes. Okay. So perhaps don't want to have recorded, but.
Should we collect the 2 left comments or questions? I think Benjamin and Thomas.
So mine is more a conceptual issue about what is a forecast error. So as Simon said, you cannot predict a crisis, right? So that some Chinese guy thinks it's wise to have a bed for dinner. And what develops out of this, that is not a forecast. So why call it a forecast error if you have a huge increase in debt in 2020? So from my point of view, it would be important to take out at least 3 years, so 2009, 10, and 2020. And most likely what you then see is, so your first graph of the years was quite telling, so that in general, the forecasts are too pessimistic, because if GDP increases, you tend to have too pessimistic forecasts. Then hits a crisis and you have a huge too optimistic error. And as the negative shocks are much stronger than the positive shocks, you have an overall result of too optimistic debt forecasts. But so the conclusion to take out that debt forecasts are too optimistic if you rely so much on a few outliers, that is perhaps a bit too much. So
thanks for the remark, and I totally agree, but we did exactly that.
okay.
This was part of the robustness checks. We excluded exactly those 3 years. I mean, we did it, we published actually only the COVID, but we also did exclude the crisis years. I mean, the financial crisis is a bit harder to find exactly the years that we want to exclude because bank nationalization goes for a long period. But we tried exactly that, and the story didn't change. Of course, the focus area become a bit smaller, sure, a bit less over-optimistic, but they were still over-optimistic and significantly over-optimistic. So we did that.
Okay.
And what we want to show is, I mean, it's hard to forecast. I mean, there might always some things happening. I mean, how can the European Commission insist on having like a debt forecast for in T plus 10 or in T plus 7?
So it was really like
in
this
T
idea
plus
of,
4,
okay,
it's
we now
already
fix it for
difficult.
10 years.
And if it's not considered as a target, if it was considered as a target you wanted to stick to, then you could do whatever in between. There might be an outlier 1 year, but then that focus there in the next year should decrease, which is not the case. I mean, not in our sample.
So it was really not about like criticizing in general that the forecasts are bad or something. That was not the intention, but it was like, if we now decide to go even further in the future and we want to assess the countries by this path that we now predict for the next 10 years, then we really have to ask how reliable are these forecasts? And do we really want to assess the countries by that?
Yeah, sorry.
Thomas, I have to.
What I want to say has already been told. I think the Stability and Growth Pact requires convergence to the target levels with respect to debt and deficit ratios. And that has as a consequence that the countries will write into their forecasts that they are converging, because this helps them to avoid an excessive deficit position. I think that's for me, the main explanation for the growing forecast era over time. And the other thing is, I also think that the 2009, 10, and 20 are extreme years. And if you do some sensitivity analysis, that would be a candidate to left out and to show that the rest of the forecast eras also carry your main arguments and results. Yeah, and maybe you can gather data about the banking rescue measures that have been taken for the countries, and if you subtract this from the realized SFA, you may get a adjusted SFA, as you have got an adjusted business cycle deficit measure. And if this is still significantly positive, that would be also an interesting information, because at the moment it looks like, okay, banking rescue measures drive this result.
I mean, it's even interacting, because after a crisis hits, the stock of your debt is much higher. And if you then have the anchor value, the forecast error gets larger, right? So even if you take out single years, the debt level is much higher afterwards, right? And that increases the forecast error.
Okay, so I'm afraid we ran out of time. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for the presentation and the comment. And with that, I say have a good afternoon and next time.